let's begin by reading the first commandment from each of these versions. You can do Deuteronomy 5 first and Exodus 20 right afterwards. Now, who's willing to do that?
Oh, on the one that Deuteronomy, scroll it down so 5 is at the top of the screen.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay.
Oh, here we want I am the Lord.
Yes.
Right.
Okay. And then here we want I am the Lord. Okay.
All right. So who would like to read?
Well, I can read. So in Deuteronomy, it's how far do you want me to read?
Let's just do one commandment at a time.
Okay. I am the Lord. I, the Lord, am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods besides me.
Okay, and now from Exodus.
I, the Lord, am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods besides me.
Okay, so
only difference is, and I don't think it makes any difference, is beside is plural.
Yeah, I think that's just some kind
of typo.
Secrecy of the translator. Yeah. There are no differences in this first part. And I wanted to mention that there is a model for the Ten Commandments that we find in a class of treaties in the ancient Near East, king vassal treaties, and beginning with identifying the king and why people ought to be beholden to him is exactly where they all start. I am King so-and-so, and I am the ruler of X, Y, and Z, and that kind of language. So this is the beginning of what's called the suzerainty treaty. And we find this language in Babylonian sources, in Akkadian sources, and so on and so forth. So we start out with the idea that the Ten Commandments, or the Decalogue as it's often called, is not entirely without precedent. It is something that fits into the general culture of the ancient Near East. But as you'll see as we go along, there are some interesting differences that pop up. So let's move on to the third of the 10 commandments.
Well, I've also been thinking about what is it when that we trust or listen to someone, and one is who they are, and the other is what they've done for us.
Yes, that's a very good point.
Both of those features are here.
Yeah, so in that sense, it is a very human document, and fits in with the general position that Judaism takes, which is that the Torah speaks in the language of human beings. And this has some interesting implications because, as we'll see, we can account for some of the differences between one set of commandments and the other because of, in one case, Moses is involved in the transmission. In the other case, it's less clear what Moses' involvement in the transmission is. So let's read on to the next to the mitzvot. Would somebody like to volunteer for that? So verse 4. in the Exodus text and the 6, wait a minute, I think we moved 8. 8. Okay. Somebody like to read that?
You shall not make for yourself a sculpted image, any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters below the earth.
Right.
Deuteronomy.
Seems like it is a total prohibition of any kind of representational art, which some people have taken seriously. And
But just one question about that.
yeah,
With the word sculptor, it seems like it would be a three-dimensional art and not two-dimensional, not
yes,
a painting.
yes.
Has that been pretty consistent?
Well, sure, because what do you think the concern would be on the part of the Torah about any kind of representational art, whether it's two-dimensional or three-dimensional?
That it would be an idol.
It could become an idol. And the whole point of an idol is that we mistake one thing for another. That is to say, we look at, I don't know, a picture of, I don't know, a bird, maybe, or a bull or whatever, and we think that that representation, whether it's in 2 or 3 dimensions, is the divinity itself. And that's what we don't want to do. That's a grand mistake.
But it seems sometimes people believe this is talking about two-dimensional images too.
Yeah, that would be, in my view, a misinterpretation.
Okay.
Certainly they meant, in my opinion, to include statues and other forms of three-dimensional objects, talismans, or whatever it might be, that are held in divine awe. I mean, that's worshipped or what have you. So I think it's meant to include both 2 and 3-dimensional representations. But let's look at these 2 texts. Are there any differences in the language?
Well, they seem to be identical.
Yeah, they do seem to be identical. Again, we're dealing with a section of the 10 Commandments that is often identified as being sort of the theological section. The first 4 commandments in the 10 Commandments are theological in nature, defining who or what God is and the relationship of human beings to God. So starting out very, very pronouncedly with dealing with the question of idolatry would be exactly where you would expect a document such as this to start. So we begin with a theological section, but we will move shortly into a section which is not so theological. But let's take the next section, and we'll see the continuation.
Well, I have one question. You can understand I'm interested in this as an artist.
As an artist, of course.
Hearing about it all these years, but or any likeness of what is in the heavens above or on the earth below. Or so it seems like it's A or B, that there's a sculptured image or this other thing, any likeness of anything. What is that about?
Well, I think that it means it's a prohibition against representational art because of the possible mistaken idea that the object itself, whether it's 2 or 3-dimensional, is the reality that it represents. So I think that the idea here is that human understanding is easily confounded by representations. And in
There's
fact,
also the idea that kind of competing with God. God has made these things.
right.
And is there a problem with, man trying to outdo God in a sense?
Well, in a way, I mean, to say, if we were to make a mistake and misunderstand that the representation of a certain object and the object itself are identical, then in a way we're kind of usurping God's position as the creator of that item, whatever it happens to be. So one wants to be careful of that. It is a way of mistaking our relationship with God and arrogating to ourselves the unique powers and dominion that belong to God as creator.
I think
So,
Stan wants to say something.
yeah, go ahead.
So in other words, all of art in that sense, visual art, is forbidden. And in other words, painting Monet or something like that.
Only if it's representational.
Well, he painted 11 of haystacks. That would be
I
representational,
don't know.
right?
Mark Rothko isn't representational. Jackson Pollock's not representational.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Stan. For example, there's a long history of illumination of manuscripts in Judaism. And if you, for example, look up ketubot, marriage contracts in online, you'll find that there's a very long history of the decoration of the marriage contracts in many different times and locales. They don't represent, they're not representational, but they are highly decorative. Some of them are remarkably beautiful, but they are not meant to, generally speaking, represent anything in particular. Now, having said that, this is not what you would call a very strict understanding. You might find on an ancient ketubah a tree, a palm tree, for example, or an etrog or something of that sort. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's an absolute prohibition. What is absolute, at least at the beginning, is the representation of the human body, or certainly the representation of God. Those are clearly out of bounds. Other kinds of things, it gets fudged a little bit from time to time.
Because I'm
You know,
thinking,
I just wanted to interject that I remember a few years ago, we had some friends we were in New York, who were Orthodox, actually on the verge of becoming ultra-Orthodox, which they later became. And we went to, these were young women, maybe around 20 years old at the time. And they did not feel comfortable in the museum. They did not really want to go at all. And they had a very, what's the word? Sort of like, you know, we ought not really to be here. We're uncomfortable being here. And so I think that in perhaps Orthodox Judaism, or certainly ultra-Orthodox Judaism, they are very, very strict about any kind of doubt that could possibly be sown in an individual's mind about not worshiping in this way or not admiring or not
I think you're
appreciating.
exactly right, Judy. But what I'm getting at is also that this is something that is sometimes more strictly observed than other times.
Uh-huh.
So, for example, I have a what's called a Mizrak, which is it's sort of like a prayer device that you use by putting it on the eastern wall of the shul, and you pray facing it. I didn't even think about this. I think you just pull it off the wall. But it uses only letters of the Hebrew alphabet, but arranges them so that they look like a menorah.
Uh-huh.
So now, is that a menorah? Is that just the Hebrew letters? Is this representational?
So is that the meaning of those artworks at CBI in the hallway where it's like a verse from a part of the Torah in the shape of something?
Yeah, that would be the same idea.
I had no idea that there was a reason. I mean, other than just a thing to
It's
do.
an approach to the creation of art, which sort of tries to bridge the gap between representation and which I say, really kind of an abstract.
It's interesting. And people were doing that with typewriters,
Yes, yes,
putting letters in shapes and making Christmas trees, things like that.
sure.
And when you think about it, with petroglyphs and that sort of thing, that sort of representational art of a hunt or something predated the Torah by thousands of years. They find on caves and stuff. So it clearly was something that existed at the time the Torah was written.
Yeah, well, this gets now into the area of folk practice and folk custom. And we all know in various ways how representing something can be part of a folk tradition, even in order to effect reality. For example, in voodoo, you can, and not just voodoo, other forms of what we might call what's the word you're looking for, superstitious practice. You create the image of something which you then burn or tear apart or desecrate in some way. And it's meant to have some sort of evil or deleterious effect on what you represented. This is the same idea that somehow the representation and the thing itself are identical, or they are, one is superimposed on the other. So yeah, Judy.
I have a question about this. Would the works of art like poetry or written artistic novels by Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, or poetry with images that are very strong and so on
It
and so
doesn't
forth,
apply to the written word.
it does not apply.
No,
Okay.
no, because then the Torah would be a problem. No, no.
Because
We're talking now about the things that might relate to the possible confusion
uh-huh.
of the object with the thing itself. You can have an excellent description of the chase of Moby Dick in
Mhm.
Herman Melville, but no one will think that is actually Moby Dick.
Mhm.
So it's that's the distinction.
What
All right, I
about
want to
Plato
move
and
on
the
to the
image?
next one if I can, because there are some here that I want to make sure we get to.
Okay,
So let's move on to the next section. You shall not bow down. Somebody take that, please.
I'll take it. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me,
And the next one, please.
but showing kindness to the thousandth generation of those who love me and keep my commandments.
Okay. So this is a kind of a bridge between the theological and the social. In fact, we know from comparatively speaking, recent research that in order to change um, deeply ingrained behaviors that a person may have, um, requires 3 to 4 generations. Uh, they don't get changed in less than 3 to 4 generations. So if you're looking, this comes up, for example, in the context of dealing with um, families which are abusive in nature. What's required to eradicate the abusiveness in this set of relationships, and it doesn't happen um, in less than 3 or 4 generations.
Is there something else that's 7 generations? Like if people did things 7 times back, it's still part of you, or
I can't think of that.
okay, so this is it. Okay.
Yeah, and I also want to point out that people often will cite the first part of this verse as somehow showing the intemperate quality of biblical religion. But even if you don't care about what the actuality is, how you change behavior, the emphasis here is also on God is kind and so forth to the thousandth generation, which is to say that there's a relatively small window of time where the impact of the, if you want to call it sinful behavior, has an effect, but a much larger window where um, a more generous and open and tenderhearted consideration might hold sway. So it's not nearly as intemperate as people like to make it out to be. So if we can move on to the next section, that would be great. Now I know that's not Bella. Who is that? It's all right. Okay, so you shall not swear falsely. Kim, can you back this down so we can see the Hebrew text here? There you go, perfect. Excellent, excellent. So somebody read this one, please.
You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name.
Okay, now this has a specific locus. It has to do with giving testimony in court. Lo tisa et Shem Adonai Elohecha l'shav. has to do with not taking the Lord's name. Now, we usually find this translated in various versions of the Bible as you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, which gets interpreted by a lot of people as you're not allowed to use cuss words. It is not about using cuss words. It is about lying in court and doing so in the context of having taken an oath, using God's name to tell the truth.
Rabbi?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had a debate, brief one, once with a rabbi, and I'd like your take on it. That some people say, yes, by whatever, I will stop by to see you, Mom, tomorrow, and then you don't go. Is that violating the commandment? It's not in court, but you have sworn an oath to do something, and then within a specified time, and then if you don't do that, that's it. So consequently, I typically, when I'm dealing with the future, is I intend, because that's a
Okay.
present tense. I can say whether that's true, but there are many things that could interfere with my doing something in the future, which the snow
Which is
last
why
week.
people say things like, God willing, I'll come by and see you tomorrow.
Right.
So that it becomes something that God either encourages and supports or not. But it's not because you have denied the binding nature of your oath. This is specifically about using God's name
Right.
as the authority upon which you base your promise. So if you say, I will do X, what you're saying is that God is out of the equation, that what God wants or doesn't want is not relevant. And that's a problem. It's a problem because what happens in the world is something that is consonant with what God wants to happen. So even in other religious traditions, say in Islam, the word inshallah, which is used all the time, means with God's willingness, XYZ, whatever happens to be. So
Okay.
people insert that in all sorts of statements. So I'll go to the store, inshallah, and so forth. It's the same idea. My question is, what is the range of possibility of human beings making promises? That is to say, are promises that we make purely something that relates to our own interest and our own desire, or are the promises that we make part of the way God works through history and society? I think the Jewish answer is that we are not alone in the universe, and what we do or what we don't do has to be in some way coherent with what God intends for us to do. So it's a kind of mixture of categories, not unlike the mixture of categories involved in idolatry. To say that it is purely my intention, which governs what I am able or not able to do, what promises I am able or not able to keep. You can imagine that there would be lots of promises that people would make, which they wouldn't even want God to hold them to. Now, when we get angry, we make promises, although maybe we don't even think of them as promises, which we are very, we very easily retract once we're not angry anymore. There are all sorts of things like this where we use the language of the promissory language as a way of expressing our intentions, our desires, our aspirations, whatever you may want to call them. But those things have to be in line with God, what God wants for the world. I'll give you a good example here. There's something called a bracha levateilah, which means a blessing of what I would call blessing of erasure. Now, for example, you're driving home and you see that you can't see exactly which house it is, but there's some house down the road that's on fire. Can you say, God, I hope that's not my house? The answer is no, you can't say that. Why wouldn't you be allowed to say, I hope that it's not my house?
Well,
First of all,
wishing something bad on someone else.
well, that's right. You're saying, I hope that it's somebody else's house that's on fire and not mine. But it's also this confusion about what it is that you can promise and what you can't promise. What you can't do is assert either directly or indirectly that you can be in control of what is actually happening. That is we might say, a maseh gevul, gone beyond the limits of our human capability. And again, it's a confusion of categories. We are not the ones that are in possession of those powers. If there is a house that's on fire, God forbid, see, I just did it. It's not like we can wish it were not happening, and that our wish was somehow stronger or took precedence over the actuality of what's going on in the real world. I wish Donald Trump had never been president. That is a bracha levateilah, because he was president. And by wishing it, what is it? What do they say? Wishing makes it so. It's not true. And we don't conduct ourselves that way. Okay. So far, we found a lot of agreement between the version of the Ten Commandments in Exodus and the version of the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy. Now we're going to get into some differences, which I want you to pay close attention to, because they deal with this question of how precisely the language in the Torah is framed. So let somebody read the next section.
From which book?
We're going to read both of them eventually. So
Okay, well, I'll start with Deuteronomy.
okay,
Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor.
well, let's stop there.
Okay,
All right. What's the analog on the other side?
it's observe, but in Exodus, it's remember.
Yeah. So what is the difference between remembering the Sabbath day to keep it holy and observing the Sabbath day to keep it holy?
Remembering is just, yeah, I know that's supposed to be, but observing it means actually following the rule.
Yeah. observing it is about behavior.
Right,
Remembering is a mental process,
right.
which may or may not involve any particular kind of behavior. So yeah, this is where we're moving into the area of human behavior, and particularly there is a notion in Jewish sources that this has to do with the two different sets of the tablets, the one that God creates initially and is shattered by Moses, and the second that replaces it. That this is a difference between those two, the Luchot HaBrit, the stone tablets of the covenant. What would be the implications of these two? One is remember, all right. One is observe. Are they directed to the same people?
To the same people?
Yeah,
I well, certainly the one in Exodus is to all of the Jewish people, because they're at the foot of the mountain, and it says very clearly above it that I make this, with not only those who are here this day, but those who are not.
right.
So that's clearly directed to the entire people. And that's the wording that remember. I don't know. I'd have to go back to the top here. Well, Moses, this is in 5 in Deuteronomy. Moses summons all the Israelites and says to them, "Hear, O Israel, the laws and rules that I proclaim to you this day. Study them and observe them faithfully. The Lord our God made a covenant with us and it's the same kind of wording. It's not only those. So I would assume he's talking to that both cases they're talking to the same people.
Well, I think it's true that Moses is talking in both cases to the Israelites, but there is a possibility that's introduced in substituting the word remember for the word observe. If you are intending the words to be directed to a wider audience, about to Gentiles, towards people who are not Jews or not part of the Jewish people, remember is applicable. It's relevant. The laws about observing the Sabbath are not required of Gentiles. They are required of Jews, but everybody has to remember. Now, this is something that we see as it works out in actual history. The Christians, for example, don't observe all the same laws about the Sabbath day that Jews do, but they do have a remembrance of it. Well, so what does it mean to say that you remember the Sabbath day as opposed to enact it through laws and customs and so forth? What is it that is of value? What's the core of remembering? I think you might want to consider that it has to do with the Sabbath being a concept that motivates people and helps to shape their behavior, even if it doesn't entail specific laws and customs which are obligatory in nature. You might, for example, if you are of a certain kind of Orthodox Jew, you may tear your toilet paper in advance of the Sabbath. because tearing paper is something you don't do on the Sabbath. I don't think that's binding on Christians, but remembering not to do work is something that's relevant to Christians as well.
I think Kirby wants to say something, and so does Debbie,
Kirby and then Debbie.
and then Kim.
Okay. In Exodus, the 31st chapter, starting with verse 12, let me just read. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so that you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. And then the 14th verse, observe the Sabbath.
Right.
So there, observe is used twice in contrast to remember in verse 8 of chapter 20.
That's entirely relevant. Deb, what do you want to?
So to me, this seems like, if I'm following you correctly, I'm sensing that we're talking about a concept that you have illuminated upon us many, many times over the years, which is this idea that as opposed to, say, Christians who say, I don't even know if I know the right verbiage, but, repeat the rosary 20 times and you're good to go. That you've often impressed upon us in this group that it's about the idea that you can't just say these things, you have to actually embody them. You have to actually do these things. And that Judaism itself is one of the things that separates Judaism from some of the other religions is this idea about the ritualistic behavioral component that accompanies the expression of prayer, if you will.
I think you're exactly on target, and just to fine tune it a little bit, I don't think that Christians are not under obligation to behave in a way that is consonant with the concept of the Sabbath, but they don't have specific laws, specific mitzvot that are involved, whereas we as Jews do. That's a distinction that I think is important to bear in mind. It points to a larger or more universalistic understanding of the Torah, to say that the concept of the Sabbath is divinely ordained and is relevant to all sorts of people, and not only to Jews who also have to be aware of the concept and what it means, but who have been given, for better or for worse, specific ways of enacting that concept.
Well, but Rabbi, that goes beyond what's in Torah to the building of a fence around the Torah through rabbinical statements. And I'm thinking, and Kerry, Kirby, I mean, can correct me here. When we moved to Texas in 1980, very few things could be sold in stores, just really what supported life. And that was on Sundays. Now, was that meant, Kirby, to be keeping the Sabbath?
That was a civil law, which makes no sense. Every day is holy in God's
Okay.
mind.
Yes, but
Every day is holy. That was a civil law that made no sense.
Okay.
I don't disagree with you, Kirby, but I would add that these so-called blue laws were enacted in order to remove impediments to the involvement of people in their church activities, or to distract them from that. There were blue laws in many, many different states in those days, and although I do agree that they were not divinely ordained in the same way that the Torah itself was. I'm a little rushing here at the end because I want to get to some of the ending parts. Can we let's see, can we move this up a little bit, Kim? Yeah, there we go. But yeah, all right, this is a good one. Let's read through this When 6 days shall you labor. Okay, will somebody take that on?
6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or your ass, or any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do.
Okay, and the other side?
6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements.
Okay, so there are a couple things here that are very important. One is I mentioned that we are already seeing a move towards a more universalistic kind of language in the Ten Commandments, and this continues that idea. What is the universalistic component of this of the Ten Commandments here?
Well, about the stranger, but I take it that Exodus is before Deuteronomy. No, or is it after?
Before.
Meaning in terms of being written,
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
Exodus is before.
okay.
Well,
But it seems to be the more, oh, I guess they both have stranger in your settlements.
Yeah.
They do, they do.
Yeah.
And my point is simply that it's meant to be more inclusive, and it represents a reality in which people who are not members of the people Israel are considered part of the community, even though they are not specifically bound by the same laws. This is important to bear in mind because it pops up in other contexts as well. You'll remember that we've spoken in the past about the Asaf Suf, the mixed multitude who left Egypt with the Israelites and became ultimately a part of the Israelite community. Or, for example, the question of a ger tzedek and a ger toshav. The ger tzedek is the one who, which means the righteous stranger, somebody who converts to Judaism. Ger toshav is a Gentile who merely lives among the Israelites, but who follows the laws of the Israelites as well. It's like being a resident alien today. Somebody comes to the United States, they've got their green card and so forth, and they are required to follow the laws here in the United States, even if they're not American citizens. So you can't say, oh, listen, I can go 90 miles an hour here because I'm not an American. That's not how it works. So again, this points towards a more inclusive understanding of the nature of community. Okay, can we zip down?
There's one thing that was in Deuteronomy that's not in the other, and that is the very last phrase where sort of an explanation of why it's the part, so your male and female slave may rest as you do.
Yes.
And that's not seen in Exodus. So it's almost, this is why I'm commanding you this. It's almost like an explanation.
It's another kind of inclusivity to make sure that we understand that those people who work for us as Israelites or as Jews get a Sabbath also.
Right.
And you can understand how, if they didn't, this would undermine the observance of the Sabbath in general for Israelites. But it also is meant to make the Gentiles who live in the community of Israelites feel more a part of that community. So they are, they participate in the Sabbath to the degree that they are able. Now, here we get one of the most important differences
Mhm.
between the Deuteronomy verse and the Exodus verse. Would somebody read the next section, please?
Honor your father and mother.
No,
No, you're too
Oh,
down.
Oh, okay. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Shall I
Okay.
read the other one?
Yes.
For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it.
So here we have two very different explanations for what the basis of the Sabbath is. In one case, we rest on the Sabbath because that's what God did in the act of creation.
Uh-huh.
And in the other, we rest on the Sabbath because as a memory of or reaction to having been slaves in Egypt. Now that also has to do with rest. Presumably, if you're a slave, you don't get rest, or you don't get rest except with the permission of the slave owner. There are two different rationales for the Sabbath. I know we're at the end of our time, and so if you'll give me permission just to add one sentence or two to this, I would appreciate it. And then we'll move on for next week. The idea is that there is a connection between history and theology. The idea of resting on the Sabbath is connected to the idea that Christianity is expressed as imitatio Dei. You do things in imitation of God. But it's also about the expression of human character, human personality. So resting is something we do in emulating God, but resting is also something that we do because human beings need rest. They need to be able to recharge themselves and so forth. We wouldn't say that God has to rest because God needs to rest. If God rests, it's for some other kind of reason. And we can go into that next time. But for human beings, if we don't rest, we are unable to function properly. You know, they're saying, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Well, that's true for all human beings. So on the one hand, we have a practical reason given for the Sabbath. And the other, we have a theological reason that's given for the Sabbath, both of which are important to bear in mind and which we pay attention to and hallow in taking the one day of the Sabbath for a special time, which um, regenerative rest for human beings is emphasized, and the cessation of the ongoing act of creation is seen and understood. So there's more that can be said about this section and the rest of the Ten Commandments. what we're gonna do next time is we're gonna finish up 10 commandments. And then we're probably gonna deal with the two different accounts in Numbers and in the Deuteronomy about the so-called spies who go into the land of Canaan.
Rabbi,
Yes, go ahead.
yeah, where's the V'ahavta? Isn't it near this passage in Deuteronomy?
Yeah, the Yahafta is like right after.
Okay,
But
'cause,
this
I do have a question on that. So I
Okay.
would like this to cover that when we get to it, okay?
Sure, sure.
Okay.
No
Can I ask
problem.
you a quick question, Rabbi? And you don't have to
Sure.
answer this. I'm just putting it out that when we were talking about this commandment right here, I actually had a completely different interpretation of the one in Deuteronomy. So I appreciate
Oh.
that we're having this discussion. I'm not saying this to say I'm wrong or I'm right, but more that it's interesting that I didn't see it the way that apparently it's intended. The way that I read it was more as if you observe the Sabbath out of gratitude for the fact that your Lord has granted you this privilege.
Well, that is a different interpretation. I am not making a judgment about it. It's not the typical interpretation, but it makes sense. So, why not? I mean, there's no boundary here that says that's beyond the pale. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a reasonable way of looking at it.
Well, I'll
Okay.
just,
Yes,
okay, thank you.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I recognize that there's a fair amount of projection in that, which is why I'm glad that we have these discussions, because I don't think I would have seen it in this other way before.
Well, that's hopefully what I can contribute to our discussion group. So, okay, I hope everybody's well and has a good Sabbath, and we'll get together next Thursday.
Thank you.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.